In chapter 10 and verse 2 following, the writer of Mark's Gospel, just read, has on the surface a teaching about marriage and divorce. It's not a particularly comfortable teaching, especially in today's world, and one which has caused many people to leave the church and feel judged. And of course, sometimes it suits us teachers of the Christian way who need to quote the scriptures and the law to apply rules just like the Pharisees did. We just use a different language. The Pharisees said, "The law of Moses says this, why don't you do it?" Very often we say, "The Bible says this, why don't you do it?" And we often think that once we've said it, this is how God sees it and how all people see it. But Jesus' teaching on divorce in this context is in response to a favorite pastime of the Pharisees, which was to test Jesus. And as Jesus normally does, in response, he sorts out their motive for them. This is what the law says, he says. But can you see why you ask the question? And the Pharisees, of course, are wanting to trip Jesus up and to test his adherence to the Jewish law, because if they convict him correctly, well, then they can put him aside and they can discount what he says and what he does. Eventually, of course, they do convict Jesus and they kill him. If you read a little on to the end of Mark's Gospel, you'll see the high priest saying, "You heard his blasphemy. He said he is the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. And by our law, he should die." So ultimately, the Pharisees find a way, no matter what it is, whether it's about the temple, whether it's about him, whether it's about who's the Messiah, whether it's about divorce, whether it's about all the things that they attack Jesus on. On the divorce issue, the quote is from Genesis 2, verse 24, that a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined with his wife, and what God has joined together, let no one separate. And those are the words that we use in our prayer book, in our marriage service as well. Elsewhere in the New Testament, the absolute prohibition on divorce is relaxed in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19 and in 1 Corinthians 7. The scriptures seem to relax the strict adherence of the Jewish law to divorce. And, of course, Jewish law itself assumed that, in its strict form, that adultery was committed against the husband by the wife, not the other way around. It's a little patriarchal, we'd say, in our world, but that's the kind of society that existed, and it's the society into which the Gospels were written. And it's not that we shouldn't have right teaching on issues of marriage and divorce. Thank God that we have some guidelines which we can apply to holding relationships in society. But it's about how and about with what attitude we apply those guidelines. Jesus is always at pains to draw people back to the main issue. What leads us away from God and what leads us towards God? And how do we love God and love our neighbor as the chief commandment of life in God, as Jesus speaks it in the New Testament? So this teaching of Jesus is about what is your motive and what will lead you closer to God. Will it be a legalistic attitude or a loving attitude? Again and again, Jesus uses the stories of the Pharisees to show that too often we express our sense of worth and our sense of importance by fixing our relationships and the way we do it to be superior, ensuring that we have the edge. And that means if we elevate ourselves to a place of being superior and being right in something, what we are doing is ensuring that others are wrong or others are inferior in theirs. So that's what Jesus was getting at in the attitude of the Pharisees. For them, it was to show superiority through knowledge of the Jewish law. This is what the law says. This is what the law says. This is what the law says, is what they would quote. And so it was important for them to ensure that other people didn't know the law as well as they knew the law, and therefore couldn't equal their superiority. So when you brush the dust away a little, you see what Jesus is actually saying around the teaching of marriage and divorce to the people who challenge him about what he's doing and why he's doing it. And of course, Jesus isn't just pointing out the superiority of the Pharisees, but he's pointing out and asking us to question where we are on that whole thing. We hear the story, saying, are you the same as they are? And so, if I need to be superior, is it because I have a vested interest in making sure that other people are inferior? And I'll do what I do to be able to keep them there in a particular way. And then the writer of Mark's Gospel puts a passage once again on children coming to Jesus just after this difficult issue that Jesus addresses with the scribes and the Pharisees. And he says, whoever does not receive the kingdom of heaven like a little child will never enter it. Like I said last week or the week before, because children learn from life and they learn from significant others and they learn from their parents how to be superior and in charge, just a little while before that, when they're still playing and before they've learnt all those patterns, they practice dependence and they practice equality and they play together in a different kind of way. And that is the thing that Jesus uses to compare the attitude of the Pharisees to right relationship with God. It's because children understand their need of God. They understand their need of those who give to them. They understand the issues of dependence, is what he's really saying to the Pharisees. But you see, we have to move it from how they behave, how the Pharisees behave, to how I behave, to how I put my point across, how I show that I'm superior, or how I ensure that others are kept inferior to me. It's about my motive. And that's what Jesus challenges in the scriptures again and again. What's at the base of what I quote? And what's at the bottom of my intention? I'm going to read you a short story. Once upon a time, there was a group of people on a rocky seacoast where shipwrecks were really frequent. And they'd built a little ramshackle life-saving station. It was no more than a little hut on the edge of the mountain. And there was only one boat for life-saving, but the few people who manned the station were quite devoted to what they did, and they were a particularly devoted lot, and they kept a constant watch on the sea with little regard for themselves and their own safety, and fearlessly went out whenever there was a shipwreck and a storm. Whether or not they could see what was happening or not, they went out and to check and to rescue. And many lives were saved. And as a result of that, and the work of these people and their humble little life-saving station, the station became quite famous. And as the fame of that life-saving station grew, so did the desire of people in the neighborhood to want to belong. They wanted to be associated with this excellent work that these people were doing. And so they generously offered their time and they offered their money so that new members were enrolled, and eventually they bought new boats and new crews to go out, so that there were many more people doing it. And their hut, their previously ramshackle little hut, was replaced by a comfortable building which could adequately handle the needs of those who had been saved from the sea. And of course, because shipwrecks don't occur every day, even on that rocky coast, that place, the new place, became a very popular place for people to gather. It became a sort of local club. Well, as time passed, the members of this life-saving club became so engaged in socializing that they gave little thought to life-saving. And though they duly supported the life-saving motto, which was on the badge of their sweaters and their blazers, as a matter of fact, when some people were rescued from the sea, actually rescued from the sea, it was always such a nuisance because they were dirty and they were sick and they soiled the carpeting and the furniture in their new building. So soon the social activities of this club became so numerous that the life-saving activities became fewer and fewer. And there was a showdown at the club meeting, like happens at the occasional church meeting. And some members insisted that they should return to their original purpose and activity of just being there to save the lives of people who were shipwrecked. And a vote was taken, and the troublemakers, the ones who had said, well, maybe we should rethink what we're doing, and they proved to be a small minority, they were invited to leave the club and to start another club. And that's precisely what they did. And so a little further down the road, the coast, with a selflessness and with a daring that after a while made them quite famous, they set about their new task. And whereupon membership, of course, of the new club was now enlarged, and their hut, which was previously a little ramshackle one, was reconstructed, and idealism of really being there to go out and rescue during storm times was somewhat smothered. And if you happen to visit that area today, the story goes, you'll find a number of exclusive clubs along that coastline. Each one of them is justifiably proud of its origin. And they're all proud of their tradition. And shipwrecks still occur in those parts, the story goes. But nobody seems to care much anymore.